Hello, and welcome to episode 66 of The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. Whether you are a meat lover or a meat avoider, you will find this episode to be fascinating. We are going to discuss America's relationship with meat. What is it actually like to slaughter an animal? And how do you define the term grass-fed? And we also explore the double ARP of the food world, otherwise known as mature beef. But first, let's meet our panelists. Lynne Curry, author of the book Pure Beef. You just flew in from ranch country. Welcome.
Thanks, Catherine.
And John Schiable is a butcher and owner at Pasture PDX, a whole animal butchery. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Camas Davis is founder of the Portland Meat Collective and the Good Meat Project and author of the book Killing It. Welcome.
Thanks.
All right, well, let's dig in and just get right into the blood and gore. We'll start with that. Most Americans eat meat every day without ever having seen where it comes from. Camas Davis, the title of your book is Killing It. So I wanted to ask you, have you ever slaughtered an animal or witnessed the slaughter of an animal, and what is that like?
I've done both, and it's interesting that you use the word gore because I think that a lot of us who haven't witnessed slaughter assume that that's exactly what it is. I would say watching a coyote eat a cow is probably way more gory than most of the slaughter that I've witnessed or taken part in, which is not to say that there's a lot of methods of slaughter that are not great and can go terribly wrong and do involve gore. But in my experience witnessing what we now call humane slaughter, it's fast, it's efficient. A lot of people like to say the animal has one bad day. I wouldn't even say it's a bad day. It's more like a bad second or two. It's peaceful. And for me, there's been a real sense of reverence that surprises me almost every time that I take part in a slaughter or even witness a slaughter, whether it's at a slaughterhouse or on a farm or in a backyard. And I think in some ways that reverence is maybe what we're afraid of because it's complex. It's not a easy, reduced black or white feeling that you have when you take part in a slaughter. You actually feel like you're a part of something elemental and important, and you realize for the first time that you really can't have life without death, that death is a part of our everyday experience in many ways. We've just chosen to either not think about it or not see it.
Well, can you walk us through the kind of the logistical steps of how a slaughter might look?
It really depends on who's doing it and how they're choosing to do it, of course, so there's not any one way that everyone's doing it. But on a basic level, if it's being done well and in a humane way, you're attempting to stun the animal so that it's rendered senseless to pain. That happens in different ways, be it a captive bolt gun, be it if you're slaughtering a chicken, perhaps in your backyard, scrambling its brain by poking a knife through its top palate. There are other ways to do it. And then once that has occurred, then bleeding the animal and doing that very quickly. So the idea there is that you're trying to avoid the animal sort of being awake and feeling that bleeding occur. So whereas, a lion attacking a deer, for instance, or an antelope is not going to render it senseless to pain, in this case, we're choosing to do that to make sure that the experience is quick and painless.
And why do you bleed the animal first before?
Well, we bleed for a lot of reasons, but mostly it's to prevent spoilage as well as to prevent terrible flavor as well. I don't know if John may have some ideas about that too, but essentially by the time you're buying meat from a grocery store, there is no blood per se in that meat or on that meat. There may be some myoglobin.
Like an animal won't go into rigor mortis unless you bleed it properly. Like it won't actually seize up properly.
And you want it to seize up.
Yeah. Especially with beef. I mean, because that first 5 days where it's hanging and going through the rigor mortis, when the enzymes start to actually act in the meat as it's aging, that won't happen if there's still blood in the body.
Lynne, have you been part of a slaughter or witnessed a slaughter?
Absolutely. Since you mentioned, I live in an agricultural region in Eastern Oregon, so I arrived as a vegetarian from Seattle and was very quickly introduced to on-farm life, which, as Camas mentioned, involves death, older animals, animals that are not serving a function on the farm anymore. And in fact, my first slaughter involved a llama from a llama packer, and that was pretty interesting. And the meat was delicious. It did not taste like chicken. I've been involved in, chickens and ducks, cattle, sheep, goat, pretty much, the full livestock ensemble. And one of the things that always occurs is that it's incredibly well planned out. So everyone knows what their role is. The person who is either going to do the stunning or the killing, has that specific role, and everyone else is there in support of that. And the primary goal is to prevent stress on the animal. Mm-hmm. And that there's several reasons. Certainly in animal welfare, you want them to not have any idea of what's coming. Mm-hmm. But the other element is that the meat is going to be better if there's no stress. Mm-hmm. And so lack of stress, it's a very calm, planned experience for everyone.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it's something that everyone should witness or be a part of if they're going to eat meat.
I wouldn't say everyone.
Yeah, there are some people who maybe shouldn't witness it. I mean, a lot of my book is really exploring the stories that we in the modern world have told ourselves about what it means to kill animals for food. And what death means in general. And I think one reason that we should witness slaughter, if that's where a process that gets us food on our table, is to dispel a lot of those narratives and a lot of those stories that we tell ourselves that really have their roots in horror movies, honestly. I mean, they don't, it's not based in reality. And actually, a lot of the stories that we tell ourselves about what it takes to turn an animal into food, makes us sound almost mentally ill sometimes. Like it's not based in reality, which is not to say that there are terrible ways that we have killed animals for food in the past 100 years. I mean, that is true, but it doesn't mean that is the only way out there. And
you apprenticed at a farm in France. Were the techniques different there than they are over here?
I mean, they were certainly different than what you might see in a huge processing facility here in America. They weren't in the sense that almost all the meat that we eat, no matter where it comes from in America, is from a whole, we use the whole animal quite well. We're quite efficient at using the whole animal, and this butcher was also using the whole animal. It's just that this butcher was using it only for food as opposed to other products. But they really were, it was a family that was able to do all of the cutting themselves, and they were also selling all of the meat from 10 animals a week to 4 outdoor markets, and they sold out of everything, which was truly astounding to me. I mean, most of the butcher shops that I know of in America, small butcher shops, really struggle to sell the whole animal because we don't have a consumer base that wants to eat the whole animal. They also their products were quite different. They were quite a bit more focused on charcuterie and cured and aged meats, fermented meats, and they were using much older animals. So they cut it differently because of the products that they were able to sell. Whereas here, a butcher might only be cutting for fresh cuts. They might only be cutting, a third of the animal for fresh cuts, and the rest they might grind to go into burgers or hot dogs or sausages. So it was a much more meticulous and detailed form of butchery.
John, do you think that's changing? Do you think people are more open-minded in terms of...
I mean, some of us, especially those of us that grew up hunting, we're used to that a little bit. There's certain, I remember we were like, oh, deer heart, that's one of those things that you wanted to eat right off the bat, kind of. Or we'd even eat the liver if it was a younger animal. But no, because, if you go to a supermarket, you're not going to see any offal. And I think that's because... they're going to sell what people want to buy. And so they're selling chicken breasts, they're selling, strips and stuff like that, ground beef. And so I guess saying that also the general public they don't even know what offal looks like most of the time. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of great cookbooks out there that are for cooking offal or have parts in the book that are about that. but it's really the people that are like actually conscious of their diet or what they're trying to support that end up getting those books and reading it. And so it's almost like it's staying within that kind of community. So I wouldn't say that it's caught on quite yet.
And it may not.
And it may not. I don't
spent a big part of my crazy journey in meat trying to convince people that we should all eat like the French, and we should all eat offal, and we should or offal, excuse me. And we should all, be willing to eat every cut as a fresh cut and learn how to cook it all. More and more, I find that the way that farmers and ranchers are going to survive if they're selling directly to consumers is to get smart about what the reality is of what people know how to cook.
It's hard to talk about offal and not start judging people too.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like sitting here like trying not to say things.
I mean, I'm seeing more and more farmers and ranchers who are incorporating liver and kidney into their grind.
I feel like most people
which is interesting.
That know liver do enjoy liver. I mean, what's kind of funny is I feel like it is the older generation. I mean, a lot of us, like everyone's favorite story is like, my parents used to cook liver and onions and I hate it. And they're like, that's the reason why they don't like onions. They don't even think about the liver, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that, and it's kind of trickling down. I think the more preparations people get exposed to, which is why we're thankful for so many chefs that do integrate offal into their menu. I mean, when I was working in New York at the Meat Hook, people would come in and tentatively be like, asking all these questions about kidney or liver or heart and stuff like that, and kind of getting themselves adjusted through the butcher's, encouragement, basically, which is a great reason for why you should go to a shop that does sell it, or why you should know your butcher and kind of have that conversation. And then also shops like smaller butcher shops do a great job because we have to use everything.
And actually, I'm going to take a quick break to thank our sponsor. Let's take a break and visit McMinnville, our episode sponsor. This charming small town is in the heart of Oregon wine country with more than 250 wineries within a 20-mile radius. There are multiple boutique hotels to choose from, as well as outstanding farm-to-table restaurants, art galleries, a terrific farmer's market, very cute shops, and you don't even have to get into your car to enjoy the wine scene there, folks, because you can walk to more than 24 urban winery tasting rooms, not to mention microbreweries and a distillery. Go to visitmcminnville.com to discover more and plan your stay in McMinnville. McMinnville, Oregon, welcome to the land of plenty. And John, you said you were there recently.
Yeah, in July.
And what were you doing down there?
We did a little pig butcher demo with somebody's knives who was actually out of McMinnville, a really nice guy, for IPNC.
The International Pinot Noir Celebration.
Yep.
So, yeah, there are all sorts of cool, interesting, foodie things happening down there.
Yeah, it's a really cute area, honestly. I love, especially driving through that area. That whole kind of region right there is just, it's always enjoyable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, McMinnville. Let's swing into our second course. Lynne Curry, you live in Oregon's Wallowa Valley among ranchers, and you're an advocate for grass-fed beef. So I was hoping you could kind of clear the air on this subject. I think a lot of consumers have this vague sense that grass-fed beef is better, but we don't really know why.
It is definitely a big umbrella term that means a whole bunch of different things in a whole bunch of different ways. But I think at the very top level, at its best, grass-fed beef, the research shows that it is nutritionally, quote unquote, better in terms of it's obviously to the eye, you can see that it's leaner than what conventional beef is. Sort of 95% of the beef sold in this country comes from the industrial agriculture system. And so grass-fed beef that is raised entirely on grass is leaner and has a fat that has a distinctive yellow color. So you can see the beta-carotene. And then the fatty acid profiles show that it has a better balance of omega-3 to omega-6, more omega-3 fatty acids and other good stuff that comes from the grasses, other fats that actually come from grass, which sounds really weird. And then grass-fed beef, the animals spend their whole lives eating the diet that they were born to eat, which is grass, because they're ruminant animals. And then they have ideally a slaughter situation like Camas described. And then also they are serving a function on the farm. So they're not just grazing away their whole lives without a bigger purpose in terms of how a farm operates. And so in the best scenario, they are fertilizing the soil, they're disturbing the grasslands just enough to, stimulate plant growth. They are taking a bite and moving on and not overgrazing, which a lot of people think that, just left to their own devices that they'll overgraze. They actually can be even used for invasive weed abatement. And so they serve a larger purpose, which is really just starting to get some traction in kind of the wider world of understanding of how livestock can play a role in, revitalization of grassland or preserving open spaces that are important to things like climate change and being carbon sinks. It's now being, for a while, grass farmers were called, or, people who raise grass-fed beef were called grass farmers, and now they're being called carbon farmers or carbon farming. You're hearing that term more and more.
And can you define that?
Because in the soils, they are actually preserving the carbon in the soil. So it's called carbon sequestration.
Rather than releasing it into the atmosphere.
Actually, so when we plow, when we practice till farming, we're releasing all that stored carbon into the atmosphere. And so there is an opportunity for regeneration through building up soil, just soil matter, depth of soil provides one opportunity. And then there's this whole other conversation that is so deep around methane and an understanding about methane and how pasture-raised cattle do emit methane, but how there is cycling of methane, and we'll get well beyond my understanding really quickly. But part of it is it's like a big open question because it hasn't really been examined or studied. And, I was just reading, there's been so much about meat in the media stimulated by the alternatives, and just how much money is being put into, the alternatives, plant-based burgers. And if even 1% of that was put into agriculture, I would love to see what the possibilities are. But that may be a whole different discussion.
No, I would love to talk a little bit about plant-based burgers because it's just such a hot topic right now. I mean, grass-fed beef or just grass between your hamburger bun, which is better for for the person, for the environment. I mean, it seems like all the information we get is that we should all be going vegetarian, but.
Can I just add one thing about that? Is such a great comment you made, because one of the really important things to recognize is that livestock, ruminant animals, digest cellulose, grass, which we can't. And so one of the functions they serve, and this is, a lot of people with different ethical viewpoints will say, well, yeah, that's just a justification, but it's called upcycling. And so they can graze on grassland that can or can't necessarily be used for for growing other crops, and they produce meat. And so there's a whole range of conversations around that, but we can't consume what ruminants can. And so that is a function that they serve in turning grass into meat. Plants and how we grow plants to create all kinds of other, facsimiles of meat or, plant-based burgers, alt meats, et cetera, that is a whole different agricultural system altogether.
Lynne, I want to take you out for coffee now and just keep talking about this.
So, Camas, do you find that the term grass-fed is used a little too broadly? I know there are terms in the food world where they're not really defined. There's no FDA stamp, and so people kind of throw them around.
Yeah, I mean, technically it can just mean a cow spent a day eating grass. It doesn't. So grass-fed from a regulatory standpoint or a legal standpoint doesn't mean anything other than that, really. And so the standards that Lynne is talking about are what I look for in a grass-fed steak or in any grass-fed meat that I'm going to eat. And in addition, I think it's important to distinguish between those ways of eating grass. That eating grass in and of itself isn't just one thing. That in fact, cattle can be managed on land in a way that mimics nature and that allows the grass to keep growing and allows for more biodiversity and creates more healthier soils. Or you can allow animals to roam on land in a unmanaged way, and then you're going to have no grass eventually. So even if they're quote unquote eating grass, they may or may not be eating a diversity of grass. They may or may not be contributing to the soil health. They may or may not be contributing to deep root systems. I mean, there's such vast differences in the grass-fed world itself.
So, like the term free range, maybe that's something we should not be striving for.
In the case of cattle, actually, no. In the case of any pastured-raised animal, there does need to be management. You do need to be mimicking nature. You do need to be mimicking those herds that once existed in great amounts, who were moving around trying to run away from predators. They weren't sitting in one place, just eating the same grass over and over. And so, yeah, I think that this free range and pasturing makes us feel better about the lives of the animals, or the quality of the life of the animal. But when you think about the more complex picture of the ecosystem that we're trying to create, it's actually not good to just let animals roam around however they want to in a small amount of space.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like consumers just need to ask a lot of questions.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, or fortunately, I love asking questions, but I think we live in a culture where we don't want to have to ask questions, and that could be the problem, that we're not asking enough.
Well, so what do you all think about? Lynne and I touched a bit on these meat alternatives, like the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat. It looks like Burger King, Qdoba, Del Taco, Subway, and KFC have all signed on with these companies that are making meat alternatives. How do you feel about that? You all are kind of in the business of procuring meat, butchering meat, educating people about meat. How do you feel about the rise of the meat alternative?
I think you asking that, the temperature in the room just dropped a little bit. I think it's great that people want to kind of embrace eating more plant-based, but with the Beyond and with that kind of style, they're still highly processed. It still actually has a huge carbon footprint. If you want to eat more vegetables and you want to kind of diversify, then just go to the farmer's market and get some good vegetables. I don't think, kind of like what you were saying, like just slapping some grass between buns is really the answer if you're trying to, stop eating so much meat. Also, eating at fast food restaurants, that's just not conducive to a good diet anyways. So just being more mindful about eating quality meat and knowing where it's coming from, and then just having a good vegetable intake and a good grain intake, if that's your thing.
But to Camas's earlier point, you can't force, the consumer to make the right decisions for themselves necessarily, or you can't force them to become gourmands overnight. You kind of have to go with where the market is, right?
I don't think you need to be a gourmand to eat good meat. I mean, I think that you can eat pretty simply, know a few basic techniques of cooking, and still support the farmers who are actually trying to build something more than just an opt-out kind of model. I mean, who are actually trying to say, what is the relationship between the animals, the soil, the climate, our air, all of this stuff, and trying to actually figure out what that puzzle is and how to make it all work together. I think opting out sounds good. Opting out of eating meat sounds good. But at the end of the day, you can't grow something from nothing, that there are many, many inputs going into the Better Burger or the Impossible Burger that are not contributing to a healthy ecosystem or healthy soils or carbon sequestration in any way, shape, or form. And we have these free things at our fingertips: sun, rain, grass, poop, pee. All of these things that can actually do good things for us, and they happen to result in delicious, nutrient dense protein. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's as simple as as our Better Burger friends want it to be. And like I said in the beginning, you can't. Death is inevitable, no matter what form your meat takes or your fake meat takes.
I mean, I enjoy a really good veggie burger, no doubt about it. And I think there is consensus from the researchers and the scientists I interview for the pieces I've been writing a lot about meat and climate change and how much meat should we be eating and all of that. There is a consensus that globally, we should not have any more livestock on the land because of land use issues. It's not just about, it's about water and air quality and all the natural resources and feeding people. And also there's a widespread agreement that we could all, as first world nation, residents, eat less meat. We should consume less of everything and eat more vegetables. That's, kind of a general consensus. But I think it depends on what question are you asking? Is it to, completely eliminate animal agriculture, as a certain CEO has promised to do by 2035? That's Pat Brown, the CEO of Impossible Foods, has declared the end of animal agriculture by 2035. And I think that the issue that a lot of people raise on that is, well, what about agriculture? What happens to agriculture? Why can't farmers be part of a solution toward our global environmental problems? And John's point is, what other issues come up when we go to one system? One of the most fascinating things, at the risk of going on too long, was that there's a political scientist out of Canada who identified 3 tracks we're on. And there are the restorers, the replacers, and the remodernizers. So the remodernizers are the factory farming system that we have that produces cheap meat. Mm-hmm. And then the replacers are all these exciting new, well-funded alternatives to meat. And then the restorers, who are the farmers and people like John and Camas, and who are striving toward better meat. Mm-hmm. And that actually sees a role in nature and how we can participate in a highly functioning organic farming system that feeds communities, supports animals, supports families, and supports a society that enjoys, well-raised food. Yeah. And so it's sort of, what question are you, what are you trying to address? And people have their biases. It kind of depends, I think, where you're coming from on this big, bad question of meat.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, though, humans just need to eat simple, good food. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, the Better Burger and Impossible Burger, if you look at the list of ingredients, if you look at the inputs, if you look at all of the ways in which they get that one little burger that makes you feel better on your plate, it just does not, it doesn't add up to me. I don't get it.
It gets worse, I think, Camas, when we're talking about cell-based meats, which are going hard and fast.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you all about the Petri dish meats.
Well, it's a little bit of the same thing. It's still a replacement. So I love that construct, because you can sort of fit everyone who's weighing in on this question of, what about meat? Should we be eating meat? If so, how much? Everyone kind of fits into one of those tracks. And the cell-based meats are the replacers. And they're seeing technology as a way forward. But when I read descriptions about growing animal cells in a Petri dish, it just gets to my mind, again, my own, but we all have confirmation biases. It gets to the level of the absurd, and how much money we are spending and how much those meats cost. Thousands of dollars for a pound of a chicken nugget that already exists in nature. Yeah. And how are we diverting our incredible mental talents and time and resources into something that exists? I'd rather they create something that we've never had before. Let's create a complete novel food for humans to eat. But it also reduces eating to inputs and outputs only. And I don't subscribe to that. There are people who certainly do. And a lot of the technologists and people who look at, the feed conversion ratio of raising beef and say that's too much resources for the amount, how many gallons of water and land goes into a pound of beef, that's really looking at a very, very reductionist viewpoint. And I understand that people have that way of seeing food and life and our place on this planet. I personally feel like food has a greater social value than simply fueling my cells to function.
Yeah. I personally think that the Petri dish thing is super cool. I mean, I love science fiction. My family's all in science and engineering and whatnot. So I think it's really cool. But I would taste it, but I would never like subscribe to it, like what you were saying, Lynn. I mean, it's science. It's not like agriculture. It's not ever going to be part of a culture either. I mean, no pun intended, but it's like, what's it going to taste like? There's nothing like something that is, proven by
John, it's
history.
going to taste like chicken.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably going to taste, or like just like really waterlogged chicken. That's kind of how I imagine it. But I mean, like we've been farming and we've been slaughtering and butchering and eating meat. I mean, as long as we've been Homo sapiens. So the flavor, like the essence of what is a good cut of meat or what is actually good for your body and the community even, because it is a cyclical supported agricultural system. Like you're not going to get that out of a Petri dish. I mean, you're getting like lab coats and somebody's salary.
Yeah.
It's just not going to be the same. I think really we've grown our population fast, but I mean, it is kind of about like knowing how to really break down your diet and break down like the things that you hold value in too if you're a conscious eater, and that is like sourcing and eating really good meat, knowing your vegetables, not being like, oh, this Impossible Burger is going to solve everything, because it's not. And kind of like what Camas was saying, like the list of ingredients and then the process to get it onto that bun or even into that building, like it's huge.
Well,
And
that's a good segue to our third course, which is kind of about really thoughtful, sustainable sourcing, and it's a subject that you're a real expert on, John.
I wouldn't throw that term around too much.
Okay. It's a term that I've been seeing in the food media lately. The term is mature beef. What does that term mean? And tell me about how you've been working with mature beef.
Yeah,
It
so
sounds
that's
kind of funny,
for
actually, to say it
pasture.
out loud, mature beef. Anyway, go ahead.
For pasture, that was like the originator. And
pasture being your...
Pasture, our butcher shop, our concept. That was the originator when we were working at Blue Hill, and
Which is Dan Barber's.
Dan Barber's Blue Hill at Stone Barns in Peconico Hills in New York. We got in one of his retired dairy cows, and that term being that it's older, the milk production is weaning off, and so what they do at that point is it's just kind of like a chicken that stops laying eggs. Like either you just kind of cut it loose, and I actually learned in Oregon some people do that. Like they just let the animal live its life out, and I think that's kind of cool. And then when it dies, they bury it. But obviously not super sustainable towards your farming practices. So what Blue Hill did was they took her to slaughter, and this is an animal that was just kind of living and moving around their pasture with the other animals for her entire life. And we get it in the kitchen, and like the meat was almost like magenta, beautiful and marbled, and the fat was just so bright yellow. Like I didn't even know it was possible. I was so kind of adolescent in my my knowledge of food, and there it was, and I was like, that's when I learned like, oh, beta carotene and fat, and like just what ethical and sustainable farming practices could actually produce.
And was there something about the fact that she'd been a dairy cow previously that made her meat so desirable or beautiful? Or
Right. I mean, I honestly don't even it might have been a Jersey. I don't remember what breed it was. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it is because
so
dairy
just
cows...
the age of the cow, or is it something to do with actually being a dairy cow?
Well, I think part of it is the dairy. I think they just kind of have a different, obviously a different body system than a bred for slaughter steer. But yeah, also the age. I think the older they get, then the more those muscles are going to be worked, the more their system's going to be, taking in and working with all of these different varieties of grasses that they're eating out on the pasture or weeds or whatever. And so, yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know what's a good way to describe it. It's like aging a wine, I guess. It gets more, it's like, or to its peak at least, it gets complex over time, right? It's like when it's young, it's going to be hot or whatever. It's going to be one note. But the more it ages, if it's a good Pinot or something like that, it gets more complex. And that's kind of what it was like with that animal. We loved that. And so we were working here in Portland together, and my business partner, Kay, took me out for lunch and was like, do you remember that one time, at Blue Hill? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I miss that, and I want to get back into it. And we were so fortunate, like Camas, you were a huge facilitator of this for me, which was getting to know farmers, getting introduced to Oregon's great community of agriculture. And we were able to curate a relationship where we could source these older animals. And the reason I like the older animals is because a lot of these dairy farms, like, they're problem animals almost. Like I was talking
what do they normally do with a retired dairy cow? Yeah,
so what they typically do is once they get to that age, or say maybe they're just not producing, or they couldn't inseminate it, or it couldn't give birth again, which is how they keep producing milk. They just pay somebody to take it to slaughter, and so that means somebody's like literally driving around like a cart full of older dairy cows and picking them up and taking them to a big slaughterhouse like up in Washington or Idaho or something like that. And that all gets thrown into the commodity beef, which we see in all of our superstores. And it's so like conflicting because you spent all that time. Some of these ranch or farmers out in Tillamook, they have beautiful farms. They've really built them up to great standards, and their personal ethics, which are honestly really good. The people I've met out there have great standards for what they're trying to do and produce. And so they put all this time, effort, and money and their lives, like their whole lives into this, and then they're just carting these animals off because they can't produce milk, and they're not, these aren't operations that are raising animals for meat. So they just get carted off. And we wanted to step in and be like, what if we could wean this animal that you raised over, 5-6 years, and actually just weaned it off of milking, finished it on its own kind of time and pasture, which is why we've done a contract farmer, somebody that can kind of be our middleman, who is already in that community and can kind of help grow those relationships and help support the concept that we believe in, which is kind of the sustainable farming.
Have you found that mature beef or retired dairy cows make for a better
Absolutely. I mean, I actually had the opportunity of tasting it was like a 12-year-old dairy cow in France. That was the first time that I tasted an older animal, and it completely blew everything open for me in terms of my understanding of what I should even value when I eat meat, because I had always valued tenderness over everything else, and flavor was sort of the secondary notion, and I thought I knew what meat tasted like, but I did not actually at all. And I think that this mature meat movement is it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because it really will require consumers to revalue the experience of eating meat and to value flavor over tenderness.
I honestly feel like some of these older animals are very tender, though.
Yeah, when I talk about tenderness, I'm talking in very consumery terms, meaning if you are a consumer who thinks that all meat should be cooked quickly and on high heat, a lot of your mature meat is not going to necessarily be tender per se. Obviously, every cut of meat, if cooked right, is going to be rendered tender. So when I talk about tender, I'm more talking about the scientific muscle fibers versus our experience. Yeah. And in fact, we don't even really as consumers understand what tenderness means, right? Mm-hmm. We don't really understand the science of that, and what we expect is really just a cut that can be cooked quickly and still be quote unquote tender.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So another term I've been seeing in the food media is ethical animal husbandry. Do you know this term, Lynne?
I haven't heard that specifically, but
I'm just wondering if this is part of like a whole, the grass-fed and using the mature animal. I'm wondering if we're kind of on the cusp of another movement, kind of a pushback against the the Impossible Burger.
Well, it's a pushback against, the past 60 years of industrialized animal agriculture, which devalues the life of an animal, which is, something the three of us or the four of us as clearly omnivores have a strong position. And when we were talking about, the lab-based, cell-based meats, it's really important to acknowledge that for a lot of people that deals with a terrible ethical issue for people, which is the killing of animals. So I don't want to sound cold-hearted about that. That's a very important position. But I think, Camas brought up earlier, our understanding of how animals are raised or how they are slaughtered or quote-unquote harvested when it's, their time has come and their function on the farm, is no longer. I think ethical animal husbandry incorporates all of those values about that we are part of nature. These animals exist because they function on a farm, and they have a role to play, and they have multiple roles to play on what we're seeing with farming going toward, multi-species. So I was recently, on a ranch in Utah, and you may have heard about sort of the old schisms between cattle ranchers and sheep herders or sheep ranching, and how this was sort of an old division. And some of those remain, but those are getting blurred more and more because people are raising both cattle and sheep and chickens and pigs on the same farm because they all have a different role to play in terms of maintaining the health of the soil and feeding the farm. I mean, animals can't just live on the land. The farmers aren't just doing that, for the benefit of, they need to earn money. And I think we forget that animals can't just exist in perpetuity on someone's land without giving a return. And so there's got to be a way for a farmer, any particular operation, to earn money, because it's very expensive to have any kind of livestock operation.
Yeah.
I think that term ethical animal husbandry, too, it's really changed in the past 10 years. I mean, when I got into this, it was really about treating the animals well, animal welfare, making sure they lived the lives they were meant to be lived. They ate what they were meant to live. They are meant to eat. They were slaughtered quickly and painlessly. In the past, 5 years, that it has really changed. It still includes that, but now it's what is the impact of the animals on the land? How can the animals be used in an ethical way to address concerns about climate change? How can the animals be used responsibly to create healthy ecosystems? And it's so encouraging to see that shift, because if we just we should focus on the lives of the animals and make them good lives. But if we just focus on that, we're missing such great opportunities for agriculture to help solve some of the problems of our times.
And
that is a beautiful place to leave the conversation. Sadly, we're running out of time, and I want to get on to our dessert course, where we each go around and share something we've been enjoying this week that has to do with food or beverage. Lynne, did you bring something?
I did bring something, and it was kind of a byproduct of the fact that I had zero internet for an entire week, if you can just imagine what that's like. And so I did some sourdough baking, and I made some jam from my plums, and I got really busy on a project, and I thought I had scorched an entire pot of plum jam, but instead, you know what I had done? I had caramelized them. So I made caramelized plum jam. So my dessert is happy accidents in the kitchen.
That sounds delicious.
I love that. That does sound really good.
John, how about you? Did you bring a dessert item for us?
Yeah, not so sweet as yours, honestly. I've been really enjoying, and they've been doing it for a couple or 3 years now, I think. But Ben and Brent out of the Meat Hook do a...
And what's the Meat Hook again?
The Meat Hook is a butcher shop in Brooklyn, New York. And they are the owners, and they have a show that Eater produces for them on YouTube called Primetime. And their little steak take is kind of going through and meeting a lot of other chefs or ranchers. And their episodes kind of revolve around different preparations. Some of them very extravagant, and some of them very just kind of delicious and neat and small. Lots of sausage, lots of just cool little kind of fun, hilarious, and delicious tidbits on different preparations for using the whole animal. And one of them, which is actually still my favorite, was they went to their farm where they get, or the ranch where they get all of their beef from, or most of their beef from. And they tried also their first, like, I think it was 13 or 15-year-old. I believe it was a steer. And just kind of, they did a side-by-side with different ages. And I thought that was a really cool, informative episode on how to kind of get an idea of what it's like to eat older animals. Yeah.
Oh, we'll have to check that out.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Camas, how about you?
Well, because I talk like this every day, all day long, I'm always thinking about what are different ways I can say the same thing and simplify this very complex equation. And recently I came across Diana Rogers, which I just brought a little illustration from her website that I love with a cow eating grass. Diana Rogers, who has a website and a podcast called Sustainable Dish. She's also in the process of making a movie called Sacred Cow, which tackles all of these issues that we're talking about. She just is so smart about how to talk about a lot of this stuff. She's a nutritionist, she's a farmer and a rancher, and has just a knack for really simplifying the debate, but with complex thought behind it. So I highly recommend people listen to her or read her blog if they're interested in learning more.
Great, thank you. And for my dessert, I have some exciting news for our listeners, which is that we have a little bit of bonus content coming your way. I will be sitting down with Farida Sedigir, who is the culinary director at Vice Munchies and the host of the cooking show on Vice. She has a new book out called Munchies Guide to Dinner, How to Feed Yourself and Your Friends, and we will be adding that extra bonus content to our stream soon, so keep an eye out for that. And that relates to a favor I have to ask our listeners, which is if you could please take a moment in your copious free time today and hop online and go to theforetop.org/survey, because we would like to bring you more of the Four Top, and we want you to tell us exactly what you want and how we should deliver it to you. So thank you. And a special thanks to our amazing panelists today, Camas Davis, founder of the Portland Meat Collective and the Good Meat Project, and the author of the book Killing It, John Schiable, butcher and owner at Pasture PDX, and Lynne Curry, food writer and author of Pure Beef, who flew in today from Eastern Oregon. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
I learned so much.
Thank you, guys.
Such a great conversation. And thanks to today's episode sponsor, Visit McMinnville. Also, if you're enjoying our show and looking for something similar to add to your playlist, please check out our friends over at the Manual Podcast. Each episode features a roundtable discussion with experts or artisans in subjects like food, drink, travel, style, trades, and more. And you have actually heard some of the guys from the Manual right here on the Four Top. This little shout out to our friends Drew Prindle, Sam Slaughter, and Chase McPeak. You can download a new episode every week or check out their more than 100 back episodes on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode of The Four Top was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in the studios of OPB. Izzy Kramer is our tireless and multi-talented producer. Keelan King is our editor and also the composer and performer of our theme music. Nalene Silva was our audio tech today. Thanks, Nalene. Special thanks to the web staff at OPB who bring our show to life on the Oregon Public Broadcasting website, as well as to sound supervisor Stephen Cray. You can check out our dedicated website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, donate to the show, and reach out to us on social media. Oh, and please fill out that listener survey. It's at theforetop.org/survey. Thanks, everyone.